welcome to Game Master Soapbox. I'm Jonathan Albin, your host, and tonight we're going to be talking about the dynamics of role-playing, part 2. And we're going to be talking in particular about what the players should get out of the game session. And as a game master with 50 years of experience, a lot of players have real concerns about what they are getting for their effort. Many times, role-play games are presented as perhaps a little bit more highbrow than board games, perhaps a little bit more self-serving than card games. But the real impetus for playing role-play games is that you are getting much more bang for the buck than you might have actually realized. I have a very good associate, Dr. Mackey, who actually presented her doctoral thesis on the very merits of role-playing games and Dungeons & Dragons in particular. And in her thesis, the preeminent benefit was there were far more social interaction outputs than others might have considered. So tonight we're going to be looking at those in particular. And if you would do me the favor, go down below and click all the buttons so that the algorithm knows that you're part of our audience, and let's get going.
Absorbing damage is the name of the game. From the claws of monsters or the heat from a ball of flame, our strength in numbers is a roll of the dice.
Alrighty, so today we're going to be talking, as I said, about role-play games and why they matter to the players and what the players are actually gleaning as benefits from the game sessions. And so when we go through this, we're going to be looking at 10 different particular points. And also as they go, they are going to be arguably with increasingly improved value to the player. And in the end, of course, I'm going to request that you help me to develop an understanding of what you would like to see in terms of additional input to this environment. Role-playing has been essential for the majority of my life. 50 years is a long time to be a storyteller, and even as a youngster starting at age 11, I was endeavoring to make the game sessions mean more than just the monsters that we killed and the adventures that we had. So today we're going to be looking at those particulars and what it is that makes the role-play games matter to the players. Surprisingly, when you think of role-play games, I suppose if you look at our culture, a lot of the arrows point towards a nerdy nature or a geek nature or a somehow off or odd social cues that role-play gamers tend to draw themselves to. But the reality is that socialization skill is one of the socialization skill is really one of the outputs of a good role-playing game. Players who enter the game may have come from a variety of cultural backgrounds, a variety of educational backgrounds, and they perhaps share an inadequacy in social interaction that would cause them to look for others that would find such altered realities as valuable. But ironically, the output is actually an improved socialization skill. I always argued that when I was a youngster, I never quite fit in the mold of the genius geek, when I never stuck into the antisocial or misunderstood or any of those other cultures, because my acculturation skills had come from my socializing through roleplay, because I began to be able to play the role of a social being. And when you are able to step into an alternate reality and make it make sense, you're suddenly able to live in environments that you wouldn't otherwise be allowed to be a part of. A second thing that develops is the ability to pick up on and perhaps deliver context clues and cues to others. As a game master who was also socially adequate for communication, I often ended up being a bridge between the role-playing community and the standard run-of-the-mill community, because I could walk both sides of the line. And I could do that because I picked up quickly on context clues and cues from others to make my positioning better. Now, at the age of 11 and 12, 13, you're not aware of what those things are worth. But as time went by and issues of being able to speak with people of the opposite sex or people that were much older than you were, or perhaps didn't quite understand your culture, it became easier for me to become that intermediary, and therefore the very role of a games master became more of a bridge to other personalities than it was just merely a storyteller. And when a person picks up the ability to pick up on these contextual clues, they become better communicators. And therefore, the irony of coming to the role-play community in order to avoid using such of these, it almost became a catch-22, that somehow you were becoming better at communicating and therefore could communicate with more people, and therefore no longer needed the very culture from which you had gathered those abilities. Another critical element of role-playing that I believe is absolutely critical and why players would come to it is the very concept of verisimilitude. We often want to be able to be a part of the community of which we are, but we don't know how to communicate that. And so by utilizing an analog through roleplay, perhaps setting up straw man arguments in a play environment, you were able to inoffensively challenge those straw men and become stronger in your communication. And this analog to the real world becomes, therefore, for the role player, his sounding box, his echo chamber by which he can test his strategies and such. And to me, what's really important is that players who were playing in the analog of a high fantasy setting would set up within their own structure the concept of the bully or the villain or the dangerous one, and then interact with that dangerous one in a position of strength within the game, which then in turn gave them more internal strength for their own challenges. I can't tell you how many times that a group that you played with that had a problem with an individual suddenly didn't have a problem with that individual anymore, because one or more of them had been able to communicate their strength of personality that they had learned and developed in role play in the real world. Because I read something the other day that said that chemically there is no difference between a fantasy and a reality within our minds, that we can build the intestinal fortitude we hope to have in a fictional setting, and thereby be able to draw upon that when we need to in an actual setting. And this concept of verisimilitude, that the game world is actually an analog for your real world, provides new players, especially youngsters, a playground upon which to operate that defies the convention and yet lets us understand and explore what is real through that fiction. And in building those fictional walls that we then use for our interactions with other people becomes a way to have a frame of reference. If you have learned that your interaction with human beings is dangerous when you have a bad attitude or when your emotional state is high, you learn how to monitor that and bring it down in terms of one-to-one relationships, and therefore you become a better frame of reference for others, because you are no longer the person that they perceived you to be. You can therefore play the role of a good patient person and then become the good patient person by fulfilling that role in the physical environment that you're trying to establish that. So in a game world, of course, if you are going to play the ever present, ever patient clergyman, then when you play that role in game, you develop the skills that you would need to have in order to be that same kind of clergyman in real life. And so therefore you build for yourself internal frames of reference, and these can stay with you long after you stop playing the role of the character, and instead move on into the tangible real life that you have developed for yourself. Another element of this is situational awareness. When you are in a role-playing game, you train yourself to think about context clues, what someone is saying, what information is being provided, what their motivation might be for sharing it, and so on. And all of these begin to give you the mechanical tools that you're going to need in real life for handling these same situations. Now, granted, they are arbitrary, they are intentional, sometimes set up specifically to emulate a situation that might happen in real life, but this awareness of your environment and awareness of possibilities becomes second nature. I was several years ago, when my son was still in this was in the throes of the Iraq and Afghanistani wars. My son called me from those fields of battle and thanked me constantly for playing role-play games with him as a youth, because it set up his mind to be able to react to the environment of the real world, because he had developed these concepts of situational awareness simply by running through in his own mind what the possibilities were, what the motives of his opponents were, what their justification for action might be, and therefore be able to make conclusions about what might be the right solution. And this process really amplified once he returned home from the war. And this idea or this concept of situational awareness is absolutely an essential outcome that occurs from playing a role-playing game, because the role-playing game allows you to consider all of those possibilities and options at every turn of the game. Now, this also leads to the concept of understanding and managing the intangibles. And I say this in reference to the theater of the mind play, of which that's my jam. But the idea of playing without actual props, without mechanical objects, being able to understand their positioning, their relative location, how much they might weigh, for example, what their how cumbersome they would be to carry, provide a better way for the human mind to acclimate to the fiction that the world has placed on us. In other words, if you were told that you had to pick up and carry the transmission for an automobile, unless you had physically experienced such a thing, the idea of comprehending how big, how much it weighed, where the balance points were and such, would have to be something done intangibly. And role-play games, especially theater of the mind, really provide a way to develop this understanding of intangibles, so that even though they physically are there in the story, they are not physically available to interact with, and therefore comprehending and understanding how they would be modified or used really establishes in your mind a kind of a three-dimensional thinking, that you're not just looking at the length, width, and height of something, but you're also looking at how heavy, cumbersome, and such something might be. And this also applies to other concepts of the intangibles, like ammunition and fuel and simple water for drinking. These are all things that have to be managed in the role-play game, but are not necessarily physically considered when you're actually mechanically moving around the pieces of the game. also being able to carry information from scene to scene. While it is important to take notes and be aware of what your note-taking capacity is, the idea of having a reception in your mind of data so that as information comes in, you're able to interpolate it, perhaps work with it, manipulate it. You're allowing that information to become something easier to remember. I've read several articles that have talked about interacting with people of age. As you get older, your brain doesn't necessarily interact in the same way, and by having a role play environment where you are working in that unidentifiable space, there's a term for it, I'll think of it here in a second, but the idea of this temporal location that is within your brain that you're able to work with allows you to record, remember, and hold on to information better with a longer longevity for that information than it would be otherwise. And essentially, you become a better rememberer by being required to remember things even in the short term of a game. And this builds up your skill at being a resource for information and for gathering information in your own right. It really needs not to be said, but the idea of learning improvisation is absolutely an essential that comes from role play. The very idea of playing a character and thinking about what they may or may not be considering and what they might say in a given situation is, to a role player, patently obvious, but to someone who hasn't done any improvisation, the very idea of thinking about what somebody might think or somebody might say is alien, and the skill that you develop by improv in role play is immeasurably useful in real life. And one of the biggest outcomes of being a good role player is a much better improvisational speaker. The idea of speaking in front of individuals is itself rather strenuous and stressful, but it's also part of the very nature of role players to be able to, whether it be a grandiose presentation and speech, or whether it's a one-off conversation of short notice that conveys information. All of these are resources that the player gathers by his very experience in the game, because he is fundamentally forced by the interaction to do so. Now, this pressure that is put on us to improvise also gives us the ability to interact and interchange with people, even if the situation becomes stressful. And this is, of course, important when it comes to when we are doing presentation. Even in a public way, we need to be able to handle the concept of the extra bodies that are hearing us and being able to understand and adapt to that pressure without losing our capacity to communicate. Now, I mentioned it a minute ago in passing, but the idea of maintaining an understanding of your assets in a role-play environment may not be as spontaneous, perhaps, as a conversational piece of data that you might want to collect. But in the case of tracking how many of a given item you have remaining, how much fuel, how much water you have, whether or not you have the resources to accomplish a task, is really critically important in role play, and therefore makes you a better person in terms of real life, because you are learning to manage those resources in the intangible. I have seen dozens of times where a player has come to me after several game sessions and thanked me for teaching them how to control their assets and resources, because when it comes down to it, they're not things that necessarily come to mind, but certainly are something that the players will be needing to access later. And this ability to maintain some form of asset management, whether it just means better note-taking or perhaps a broader conception of what is necessary, really does help your players become better individuals beyond the game session as well. Now, this part, the concept of relevance retention, is really an issue of the storyteller's elemental procedures. If your game master is very driven by gathering information and sharing information, then he's going to be providing you with boatloads of data, and players need to be able to discern that which is critically important to the story and that which is non-essential and sort of irrelevant. And this relevance retention really comes down to the player's ability to understand and discern meaning from the story. While there are not a lot of examples where that is clearly relevant to the consumer, so to speak, it is important to the salesperson, for example, to know when he is providing information that is going to help change the mind of the audience, or when that information is really just a straw dog, a piece of fluff. And a good player will develop a pretty strong sense of relevance retention early on, which means they're less likely to be manipulated, less likely to be taken advantage of. And these are all, again, resources that are particularly good in later life. And picking up these skills from the table, 20 years later, you may not even acknowledge or recognize that's where these skills came from. But the idea of being a player and gaining a stronger understanding of what's going on in the world around you really does help to make you a better person overall. So when you come down to the end of it, it really comes down to what you as a player are getting from the game. If these topics that we've talked about are things that you can definitely speak to, why don't you put a comment in and let's talk about it. I'd love to hear what's gone in your life. I've had situations where people have called me from different career paths that they never would have considered when they were younger, but as their characters developed and their play style developed, then so did their confidence level, and the very things that they ended up doing were so far afield from what they ever imagined that it was, for them, revelatory. Also, if you have any additional questions you'd love to ask, feel free to post those below. We're going to be doing an Ask Me Anything on Twitch here in the next few days, and I'll keep you informed on what that will be. Thanks again for being here. I'm Jonathan Albin. This is Nikos RPG, and as my grandfather always says, go play.